You honestly thought you could steal my shares and get away with it? Look at your face!
How dare you accuse me in front of everyone?
The ballroom was the kind of room that believed in itself. 40-foot ceilings draped in crystal chandeliers. White linen tablecloths ironed to a razor's edge. Flowers imported from the Netherlands arranged in vessels that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The Hargrove Annual Gala, hosted every November in the Grand Meridian Hotel in Manhattan, was not simply a dinner party. It was a declaration, a yearly announcement that certain people had arrived, and certain people had always been there, and the two groups were not the same. Adiz Hargrove stood near the east wall. She wore a simple gray dress, understated, elegant in the way that required no effort because it required no performance. Her hair was pulled back in a low chignon, and the only jewelry she wore was a thin gold bracelet on her left wrist, worn smooth at the inner edge from years of quiet habit, from the way she turned it between her fingers when she was thinking deeply about something she had chosen not to say aloud. She was holding a small serving tray, not because anyone had asked her to, not because she was employed by the hotel's catering staff. She had picked it up from a passing attendant's card in the corridor 20 minutes earlier, simply because it gave her something to do with her hands, and because, in a room full of people who looked right through her, it completed the picture they had already drawn of her in their minds. She had learned, long ago, that invisibility had its uses. "Excuse me." A woman in a red gown extended her empty champagne flute without looking up from her conversation. The gesture was so practiced, so automatic, that it carried no malice in it, only the absolute certainty that the person nearest to her existed for the purpose of refilling glasses. Adiz said nothing. She simply took the glass, set it on her tray, and moved 2 steps to her left. Across the ballroom, she could see her husband. Raymond Hargrove was laughing. That particular laugh of his, the one that started in his chest and carried outward like a man who had decided that the entire room was his audience. He was standing with a group of men she recognized: Jeffrey Crane from the private equity firm on Park Avenue, Miles Deacon, who ran a technology portfolio out of San Francisco, and 2 others whose names she had never bothered to learn because they had never once bothered to learn hers. Raymond was 51, handsome in a way that money and certainty create. Not from bone structure, but from the posture of a man who had never been told no in a room that counted. He wore his tuxedo like a second skin. His silver cufflinks caught the light each time he gestured, which was often because Raymond Hargrove spoke with his hands the way other men spoke with their voices. Wide, sweeping, occupying space. She watched him from across the room. He had not looked for her all evening. And then, the moment that would later become the line dividing everything that came before from everything that came after. One of the men in Raymond's circle turned slightly and caught sight of her standing near the wall with her tray. He leaned toward Raymond and said something. Raymond turned, following the man's gaze. For one brief second, his eyes landed on his wife. And then Raymond Hargrove smiled the easy smile of a man completely at ease with what he was about to say. "Oh, that?" He lifted his glass in her direction, the way one might point out a fixture. "That's Ada. She helps around the house. Don't mind her." The men nodded and returned to their conversation. The woman in the red gown had drifted back toward her group. The chandeliers continued their slow shimmer above. Adiz Hargrove did not move. She did not flinch. She did not look away from her husband. She simply stood there in her gray dress with her empty tray, and her expression, had anyone in that room been paying close enough attention, carried something that no amount of champagne and crystal and imported flowers could have named. It was not hurt. It was not rage. It was a particular stillness of a woman who had just made a decision. To understand Adiz Hargrove, you had to understand where she came from, and then understand how completely she had chosen to leave that story untold. She was born in Enugu, in the southeastern part of Nigeria, the second daughter of Emmanuel Obi, a quiet, bookish man who taught mathematics at a secondary school by day and built small businesses in the evening hours the way other men built furniture, carefully, patiently, with an eye for what would last. Her mother, Grace, was a market trader whose genius for numbers was entirely self-taught and entirely unacknowledged by a world that had no language yet for what she was. Between the two of them, Adiz and her older sister Chisholm grew up in a house where money was discussed honestly, where numbers were respected like scripture, and where the words, "let them underestimate you," were spoken not as resignation, but as strategy. Adiz had been exceptional from the beginning, not in a loud, celebrated way, not in the way that wins trophies and earns applause at school assemblies. She was exceptional in the way of still water, clear, unassuming, and unfathomably deep. She finished secondary school at 16 with marks that her teachers quietly passed among themselves, unable to fully articulate what they had witnessed. By 18, she had won a scholarship to the University of Lagos, where she studied economics and finance with the focused intensity of someone who understood that knowledge was the only currency that could never be taken away. At 23, she moved to London for a master's degree in financial engineering. At 25, she joined a small asset management firm in the city, not for the salary, which was modest, but for what she could see from inside its walls. At 27, she made her first significant private investment. At 30, she left the firm and began operating entirely on her own terms, through a series of holding companies structured across 3 jurisdictions, advised by a small team of lawyers and accountants who were exceptionally good at their work and exceptionally discreet about it. By the time she met Raymond Hargrove, Adiz Obi was 34 years old, and she had already built the architecture of what would eventually become a portfolio valued at $33 billion. Raymond did not know this. This was not an accident. They had met at a conference in Geneva, a sustainable investment summit, where Raymond was a panelist and Adiz was, as far as anyone in the room was aware, simply an attendee. She had been wearing a navy blazer and carrying a leather notebook, and she had asked him a question during the Q&A that was so precise, so surgically intelligent, that he had found himself answering for longer than he intended, searching her face for something he couldn't quite name. He had introduced himself to her afterward. She had been warm, reserved, quietly magnetic in the way of people who carry no need for your approval. They dated for a year and a half. She revealed herself to him in layers. Her humor, her depth, her absolute clarity of mind, her ability to sit in silence without discomfort. What she did not reveal, not fully, was the scale of what she had built. She mentioned investments. She mentioned work and finance. She said she did well enough. And Raymond, who was himself worth a respectable $120 million through the commercial real estate empire his father had started and he had expanded, assumed that well enough meant something close to his own world. He had made the oldest mistake in the book. He had assumed that the size of her presence reflected the size of her net worth. They married in a small ceremony in Cape Town, with her sister Chisholm and her mother Grace in attendance, and Raymond's full circle of business associates and social connections filling the room with their laughter and their certainty. The Hargroves were a name in New York, old money adjacent, the kind of family whose philanthropy had plaques in university corridors. Raymond had introduced his new wife to his world with the genuine affection of a man who believed he was bringing someone into something. He had no idea she had built something larger before he'd even introduced himself in Geneva. But Raymond had his blind spots, as comfortable men often do. He moved through the world with a confident assumption that his view of it was accurate, that the map he carried in his mind matched the actual terrain. To him, Adiz was brilliant in a personal way, sharp, thoughtful, good with numbers in the household sense. She handled the family accounts. She was present at his events. She dressed simply. She did not compete with his social performance. She was, in his framing, the composed, intelligent, quietly beautiful woman he had brought home, and that framing had calcified, over 5 years of marriage, into something that looked from the outside like love but functioned, on closer inspection, like possession. He had stopped seeing her. The people around him had never started. His sister, Victoria, referred to Adiz as Raymond's African wife, always with that pause, that slight drop in register that made the adjective function as a category rather than a descriptor. His business partner, Jeffrey Crane, addressed her at events with the careful cheerfulness of a man who was certain she understood less than he did. At the occasional dinner parties Raymond hosted at their Upper East Side townhouse, guests frequently assumed she was part of the household staff, and Raymond, to his lasting disgrace, had learned to let the assumption stand. He found it easier, less explaining, less positioning. And Adiz, who understood people the way she understood balance sheets. Every line, every entry, every liability that had been quietly moved off the visible page, had watched all of this with open eyes. She had said little. She had noted everything. The pattern had not arrived suddenly. That was the thing about this kind of erosion. It came the way water moves through stone, not in a single violent rush, but in the slow, patient accumulation of moments so small, so individually dismissible, that by the time you looked at the damage, you found yourself wondering how long it had truly been happening. For Dee's, the first real moment she registered as distinct had been at a dinner party 14 months into their marriage. Raymond had hosted 8 guests in the dining room of the townhouse, business associates, a couple from the art world, and Jeffrey Crane with his wife, Pamela. Dee's had prepared much of the food herself, not because they lacked a cook, but because cooking was one of the few spaces where she allowed herself the pleasure of pure creation. She had made a Senegalese-influenced lamb dish alongside a classic roast that she knew Raymond's crowd would recognize. She had set the table herself. When the guests arrived, Pamela Crane had looked around the dining room with that particular expression of a woman calculating the value of everything in sight and said, with genuine warmth, "Raymond, your home is just beautiful. Who manages all of this for you?" Raymond had paused only slightly. "Ada handles the domestic side of things," he said, and moved on to refilling wine glasses. The domestic side of things. Dee's had been sitting at the table. She had looked at Raymond with an expression that was perfectly composed, and she had said nothing. She had cut her lamb and listened to Jeffrey Crane talk about a deal he was closing in Phoenix, and when Pamela later complimented the food, Raymond had said, "Ada cooked. She's quite talented in that way," in the tone of a man complimenting a pleasant hobby. She had noted it, filed it, said nothing. There was an evening, 6 months after that, when Raymond's college friend Marcus had come to visit from Atlanta. Marcus had arrived boisterous and warm, and within 20 minutes of entering the house had asked Raymond, while Dee's was in the same room, whether he had a housekeeper he could recommend, because his own domestic setup was a disaster. Raymond had said, "Ask Ada. She manages all that kind of thing." Marcus had turned to her, for the first time, with genuine attention. "Oh, so you're in household management?" Raymond had laughed, not unkindly, but without correction. Dee's had smiled and said, "Something like that," and handed Marcus a glass of water and moved out of the room. She had a call at 7 the next morning with her legal team in Luxembourg regarding the restructuring of one of her holding companies. She had conducted it from her home office, door closed, in a hushed, efficient 45 minutes, and then rejoined her husband for breakfast. Raymond had asked her what she'd been doing up so early. "Just some paperwork," she said. "You work too hard," he said, and kissed her forehead, and went to read his paper. The accumulation grew heavier. At the charity auction in March, the auctioneer had addressed the room by listing prominent guests, acknowledging the Cranes, the Deacons, the senator's wife, and then, turning in Raymond's direction, Mr. Hargrove and his lovely companion. Raymond had not corrected him. He had lifted his paddle and bid on a piece of art he didn't particularly want. At a business luncheon in April, a colleague of Raymond's had extended a business card to everyone at the table except Dee's. She had been sitting directly to his left. The man had simply looked past her shoulder to the person on her other side. Raymond had watched this happen. He had said nothing. It was not that Raymond was a cruel man in the way of men who take pleasure in cruelty. He was, in many ways, genuinely fond of his wife. He admired her. He relied on her steadiness. But he had made her, in his mind, a supporting character in a story he believed was principally his. And in doing so, he had given permission by silence and by gesture to everyone around him to do the same. The insult, each time, was not in the person who delivered it. It was in the person who received it and said nothing, the person who was supposed to love her best. At the Hargrove annual gala, the same gala, the previous year, a guest had spilled wine on the tablecloth near where Dee's was standing. Without thinking, she had reached for a cloth napkin and blotted it. A woman nearby had immediately pressed a $20 bill into her hand and said, "Thank you so much. You're so efficient," and then walked away before Dee's could respond. She had held the $20 for a long moment. She had folded it carefully and placed it in her clutch. And she had stood very still for exactly 60 seconds, in the way of a woman constructing something inside herself, a wall an architecture, a decision framework for what she was willing to continue enduring and for how much longer. Around her, the gala had hummed and glittered. Raymond had been on the other side of the room, laughing with Jeffrey Crane. She had watched him, and she had begun, very quietly, to plan. At home, the space. Between them had taken on the quality of a room where the furniture had not been moved, but the light had shifted. Everything looked the same, but the temperature had changed. Adiz still managed the household, still appeared at his events, still sat across the dinner table from him in the evenings, listening to him talk about deals and negotiations and property valuations with the attentiveness she had always given him. But something had altered in the quality of her listening. She was no longer simply receiving. She was observing. She watched how Raymond talked about her to others. She cataloged the language, the slight deflations, the gentle erasures, the moments when he could have elevated her and chose instead the path of least resistance. She measured the gap between who he told her she was in private. Brilliant, steady, remarkable woman. Ada, I don't know what I'd do without you. And who he reduced her to in public. The gap was the size of a wound. She did not allow herself to feel it as a wound. Not yet. She turned it, instead, into information. The gala, this year's gala, had begun with the particular tension of an occasion that asked too much from the people within it. Raymond had told her, 3 days before, that he needed her at the event. I want you there, Ada. These things go better when you're in the room. What he meant, she understood, was that he wanted the version of her that stood quietly and made his life run smoothly. The version that didn't require introduction. The version that knew when to appear and when to recede. She had come. She had worn the gray dress. She had kept her posture perfect and her face composed. And then Raymond had pointed across the ballroom and said, "That's Ada. She helps around the house. Don't mind her." She had heard it clearly. The man who had prompted the comment. She learned later his name was Douglas Fitch, a venture capitalist from Connecticut, had glanced over at her once, with the polite non-expression of a man cataloging irrelevant information, and then returned to the conversation. But that was not where the night ended. An hour later, Raymond moved his group to a cluster of chairs near the center of the room, where the ballroom opened up and the acoustics carried. Jeffrey Crane was holding court, his voice loud with wine and confidence, describing a deal he was in the process of closing. He turned to Raymond and said, "Raymond, didn't your girl grow up somewhere in West Africa? She might know someone who could smooth the regulatory path there." His girl. Raymond had glanced toward Adiz, who was now standing closer, near the edge of the group, holding a glass of water. He smiled. Not a bad smile. A comfortable one. The smile of a man who didn't clock the insult. "Ada," he called. "Not Adiz. Not my wife. Jeffrey's asking about Lego's connections. You know anyone relevant?" The silence that followed was very brief. But in that silence, every person nearby, Pamela Crane, Miles Deacon, Douglas Fitch, and 2 women from the Philanthropy Committee, had looked at Adiz with the same expectant expression one might turn to her secretary being asked to retrieve a file. And then Pamela Crane, with the bright, socialite kindness that cuts without meaning to, leaned toward the woman beside her and whispered audibly, "Raymond's house manager. Lovely girl. Nigerian, I think. He couldn't function without her. House manager." The words entered the room and sat there. Adiz looked at Raymond. Raymond looked away first, not with shame, with discomfort. The discomfort of a man who was aware, on some level, that something was wrong, but who lacked either the courage or the vocabulary to address it, and who chose, in that absence, to do what comfortable men have always done. He let it pass. He moved the conversation forward. He said something to Jeffrey about the regulatory environment in Lagos and pivoted to a different anecdote about a deal in London, and the group reformulated around him, and Adiz was left standing at the edge of that circle, not hurt in the way of a woman who hadn't seen it coming, but devastated in the way of a woman who had watched the person she loved most choose, one final time, not to see her. She set her glass of water down on the nearest surface. She straightened. She was quiet for a long time, longer than anyone noticed, because no one was watching her. She looked at her husband, the line of his jaw, the easy confidence of his posture, the way he filled a room, and she allowed herself, for exactly one moment, to feel the full weight of what she had been permitting. She let the feeling move through her completely. The years of it, the accumulated architecture of small diminishments, the public erasures, the private endearments that meant nothing without the public acknowledgement. The $20 bill she still kept, folded, in a drawer in her home office. As a reminder, she felt it all, and then she sealed it away behind her composure. The way a vault closes over something irreplaceable. She picked up her handbag. She walked, calmly and without rushing, across the ballroom floor, past the glittering chandeliers and imported flowers and the white linen tables, past the people who did not see her and the husband who had stopped looking, and she walked to the gold-trimmed doors of the Grand Meridian Hotel and out into the November night air of Manhattan. The city received her without ceremony. She stood on the pavement for a moment, the cold air moving across her face, and she thought of her mother, Grace, who had built a business in a market stall with a scale, a notebook, and an uncanny ability to calculate worth. Not just the worth of goods, but the worth of people, of decisions, of silence. Let them underestimate you, her mother had said, but only for as long as it serves you. Adiz Hargrove stood in the cold Manhattan night and acknowledged at last that the time of useful invisibility had passed. She took out her phone. She made one call. She did not sleep that night, not because she was distraught. Distress had the quality of static, and Adiz's mind was the opposite of static. It was moving with the clean, purposeful velocity of a woman who had already spent years thinking about what would be required when this moment arrived, and who was now simply executing. She sat at the desk in her home office until 4 a.m, not frantic, not tearful, but methodical. She pulled files from a drawer in the lower cabinet that Raymond had never opened, had never thought to open, because it looked like every other drawer in a room he considered part of the household infrastructure rather than a command center. She reviewed documents she had not needed to review for some time, because the architecture was already built, the positions already established. This was not construction. This was activation. The portfolio was structured across 3 primary holding entities. The largest, Meridian Obi Capital Group, was headquartered in Luxembourg and managed assets in real estate technology and private infrastructure projects across Europe, West Africa, and Southeast Asia. The second, Adara Holdings, was a family office structure registered in Delaware and operating from London, which held significant equity stakes in 7 companies, 3 of which were publicly traded. The third entity, the smallest but in some ways the most powerful, was a private investment trust named simply after her mother, Grace Emanuel Trust, established 8 years ago and entirely unknown to Raymond. $33 billion. Not Raymond's, not the family's, not the marriages. Hers, built before him, protected from him, not out of malice, but out of the knowledge that she had always been a woman who understood the value of secure foundation. She was not hiding it from him as a weapon. She had been waiting to decide if he was worthy of knowing. He had answered that question himself, in the ballroom of the Grand Meridian Hotel, with one comfortable, dismissive sentence delivered to a man named Douglas Fitch. The call she had made from the pavement outside the hotel had been to Nkechi Abra, her attorney, her most trusted counsel, and one of the only people outside her immediate financial team who knew the full picture of what Adiz had built. Nkechi was 53, Lagos-born, London-educated, and possessed a legal mind so precise that opposing counsel often described depositions with her as entering a room where the walls were already closing in. She had answered on the second ring, because she had been expecting this call, not tonight specifically, but eventually for some time. "I need everything prepared," Adiz had said. "The dissolution documents, the asset clarification filings, and the guest list audit for the Meridian. All of it." Nkechi had said, "All of it." There was a pause, not a surprise, of readiness. "I'll have the documents to you by Thursday," Nkechi said, "and I'll handle the Meridian personally." The Meridian she referred to was not the hotel. It was a Hargrove family charitable foundation, the Raymond Hargrove Foundation for Urban Renewal, which Raymond had founded 7 years ago with a $15 million endowment, and which had, through a series of circumstances he had never fully investigated, grown its assets to $62 million. He assumed this was from investment returns and donations. He had never audited the source of the growth, because Raymond had a remarkable capacity, shared by many men of a particular position, for accepting good fortune without interrogating its architecture. Adiz had been quietly managing the foundation's investment portfolio for 4 years, without compensation, without credit, without mention in a single board document, because she had structured her involvement through Adara Holdings' advisory arm in a way that was entirely legal, entirely transparent to anyone who looked, and entirely invisible to those who didn't. She had done this not to control him. She had done it because she genuinely believed in the work the foundation did, and because she was, in fact, better at this than anyone Raymond had hired. But it meant that when the moment came to step back, the foundation would feel the loss immediately and completely. She spent the week following the gala in a state of absolute composure. She continued the household routines. She appeared at breakfast. She asked Raymond about his meetings. She arranged flowers in the foyer. She did these things with the same quiet efficiency she had always brought to the domestic life of their marriage, and Raymond, who was a man more perceptive about real estate valuations than about emotional undercurrents in his own home, noticed nothing different. But she was also doing other things. On Tuesday morning, she had a 2-hour video call with her full financial team, the Luxembourg attorneys, the Delaware Trust administrators, and the senior partner at the London investment office, during which she outlined a series of portfolio clarifications and entity disclosures that would become necessary in the coming weeks. There was a structure to be made legible, not revealed out of nowhere, but positioned so that when the light fell on it, it would be unmistakable. On Wednesday afternoon, she visited the offices of the Grand Meridian Hotel and met with its general manager, a woman named Sophia Bertrand, who had been in conversation with Adara Holdings' philanthropic arm for 8 months regarding a proposed partnership. Adiz had been overseeing these conversations from a careful distance. Now she came in person, not as Mrs. Hargrove, but as the principal of Adara Holdings, and she finalized a partnership agreement herself. It included a naming rights arrangement for the hotel's newly constructed event wing. The wing would be named the Obi Meridian Hall. Adiz Obi, not Hargrove. Obi. On Thursday, Nkechi Abra delivered the documents as promised. A full legal asset disclosure, the terms of a proposed separation agreement, and, most critically, an invitation, because Adiz had decided that the truth would not be delivered in a private room. It would not be a quiet conversation at the kitchen table. It would not be a letter left on a pillow or a document slid under a door. The truth would be delivered in the same public space where the humiliation had been administered, before the same social circle that had watched her stand there with a serving tray and assumed she was staff. The Hargrove Foundation's annual board dinner was scheduled for the following Friday. Raymond hosted it every year at the Grand Meridian Hotel. The guest list included the foundation's board members, which included Jeffrey Crane, along with several major donors, the hotel management, and a selection of press from the city's philanthropic coverage beat. Adiz reviewed the guest list carefully. She made one addition, and then she made a phone call to Sophia Bertrand about the event space. The east wall of the ballroom, the wall where she had been standing, holding the serving tray, invisible, was to be cleared for a display installation. Sophia asked no questions. The Obi Meridian Hall partnership made the hotel deeply motivated to accommodate whatever Ms. Obi required. On the morning before the dinner, Adiz chose her dress with the careful deliberateness of a woman who understood that appearance was information. She selected an oyster-white gown, structured, floor-length, with a neckline that was dignified and shoulders that were uncovered and strong. She added a single piece of jewelry, a platinum and diamond necklace that had belonged to her mother, that Grace Obi had purchased for herself in the year that her market business broke its first major profit threshold. She had never worn it to a Hargrove event before. She looked at herself in the mirror of their bedroom. Raymond walked past the doorway, straightening his cufflinks, and paused. "You look beautiful," he said. "Genuine. Unaware." "Thank you," she said. She turned from the mirror. She was ready. The Grand Meridian Hotel's ballroom was arranged on Friday evening the way it always was for the foundation dinner. The same linen, the same chandeliers, the same imported flowers, the same certainty, hanging in the air like a held note, that this room belonged to certain people, and those people knew it. Raymond arrived with his usual command of the space, greeting board members, working the room with the practiced ease of a man in his natural element. He was expansive tonight. There had been good news on a Chicago property deal that afternoon, and he wore the buoyancy of it openly. He kissed Adiz on the cheek at the entrance and moved immediately toward Jeffrey Crane. Adiz let him go. She stood at the entrance of the ballroom for a moment, perfectly still, perfectly composed, and then she walked slowly toward the east wall. The display installation had been completed that afternoon. It was modest in dimension but absolute in presence. A backlit photograph panel, 6 feet high, bearing the words OBI Meridian Hall, made possible by Adara. Holdings, Adiz Obi Principal. Below it, mounted on a slim brass-edge frame, was a brief institutional biography, the kind that accompanied naming announcements at cultural institutions. Nkechi had drafted it with the measured precision of someone who understood that truth needed no embellishment. Adiz Obi is the founder and principal of the Adara Holdings Group and the Meridian Obi Capital Group, overseeing a portfolio of assets under management valued in excess of $33 billion across infrastructure, technology, and real estate investments in Europe, West Africa, and Southeast Asia. She is also the founding manager of the Grace Emmanuel Trust, a private philanthropic vehicle that has directed more than $400 million in development funding to educational initiatives across sub-Saharan Africa. She has served as a silent investment advisor to the Raymond Hargrove Foundation for Urban Renewal for 4 consecutive years. She is also, for those who did not know, Raymond Hargrove's wife. The last line was Nkechi's idea. Adiz had agreed to it after a pause of approximately 3 seconds. Guests had begun arriving in earnest by the time Adiz took her position near the display, not in front of it, not performing it, but simply near it, standing with a glass of sparkling water, speaking quietly to Sophia Bertrand, who greeted her with the warm deference of a woman meeting a principal partner for the first time in person after months of communication. The room noticed the display before Raymond did. The first to stop was Douglas Fitch, the man from Connecticut, the one who had prompted Raymond's comment last week. He walked past the east wall on his way to the bar and slowed, reading, and then read again, and then turned very carefully to look at the woman standing nearby in the oyster-white gown. He opened his mouth, and something changed his face, a recalibration happening in real time, the map shifting to match the actual terrain. Then Pamela Crane saw it, then 2 members of the press. The whisper moved through the room like a current, careful, rapid, electric. Heads turned. People reread. People looked at Adiz, and then at the display, and then back, with the expressions of those who were doing rapid and deeply uncomfortable arithmetic. Jeffrey Crane was the one who brought it to Raymond, because that was the kind of man Jeffrey Crane was. He appeared at Raymond's elbow with glass in his hand and a tight, unreadable expression, and he said, very quietly, "Ray, you need to see what's on the east wall." Raymond turned. He walked toward it, and the crowd parted in the small, unconscious way of people creating space for an important moment. He read the panel once. Then he read it again. His face was, and this was the extraordinary thing, completely still for the first time that evening. The buoyancy was gone. The expansiveness had retracted. He stood in front of those words, and the stillness on his face had the quality of a man discovering that the house he had been confidently describing to guests had foundations he had never thought to examine. $33 billion. Silent investment advisor to the Raymond Hargrove Foundation. Raymond Hargrove's wife. He turned, and there she was. Adiz had moved, during this time, from near the installation to the center of the room. Not far, perhaps 15 steps, but it placed her in the clear sight line of the entire gathered company. She was standing with Nkechi Abra, who had arrived quietly and was dressed in the sleek, authoritative manner of a woman who argued before international arbitration panels for a living. Beside Nkechi stood 2 other people, executives from the Adara Holdings London office, who had flown in at Adiz's request and who wore the composed, quietly expensive presence of people for whom this room, with its chandeliers and linen and certainty, was simply one of many rooms they had moved through. Raymond crossed the ballroom floor toward her. The room watched. When he reached her, he stopped. There were 6 feet between them. The chandeliers drew clean, even light across both their faces. "Ada," he said. His voice was low, not entirely steady. She looked at him. Her expression was not cold. It was not triumphant. It was, And this was a thing that the room could not quite process. Compassionate in the most terrible way. The compassion of someone who sees another person fully, including their failures, and is no longer surprised by any of it. "My name," she said, quietly and clearly, in a voice that carried without effort to the nearest tables, "is Adiz." He swallowed. "Eda Not tonight, Raymond." She said it gently, completely, the way one closes a conversation that has been needed for too long. She turned to Nkechi, who placed into her hands a slim white envelope, the kind that held legal documents. Adiz held it for a moment, feeling its weight, and then she sat on the nearest table between herself and Raymond with a precision that was more eloquent than any declaration she could have made aloud. "Your attorney will know what that is," she said. "You should call him this weekend." Raymond looked at the envelope. He did not pick it up. She looked at him, one long, final, clear look, and then she turned and walked back toward Sophia Bertrand, resuming the conversation she had paused, while behind her the room began the slow, irreversible process of rearranging its understanding of everything that had happened inside it. The chandeliers continued their shimmer. The flowers stood in their vases. But the room was different now. It had witnessed something it would not forget. A woman standing completely still in the center of a public space, not raising her voice, not requiring performance, not claiming anything except her own name, and in that single quiet action, dismantling a fiction that had been built around her, brick by dismissive brick, for years. Douglas Fitch was heard later telling someone near the bar that he had spoken to Adiz Hargrove, Adiz Obi, at the gala the week before, and that he had immediately understood she was extraordinary. No one who had been in the ballroom that night believed him. Jeffrey Crane said nothing at all. Raymond Hargrove remained standing at the center of the ballroom for a long time, with the envelope on the table in front of him and the display on the wall behind him, in a room full of people who were looking at him differently than they ever had before. It was, by any measure, the most significant moment of the Foundation dinner in its 7-year history. None of the official photographs taken that evening showed Raymond smiling. The story did not make the tabloids. Adiz had taken careful, legal steps to ensure that what had happened in that ballroom remained a matter of private knowledge among those who had witnessed it, rather than becoming a feature piece in the kind of publication that valued spectacle above accuracy. But private knowledge, among the social circle of people who occupied the Raymond Hargrove Foundation's orbit, was a currency that moved with remarkable velocity. By Saturday morning, Raymond had received 4 phone calls from board members. By Sunday, Jeffrey Crane had quietly arranged a lunch meeting with Nkechi Abra, without Raymond's knowledge, to discuss what the public advisory record of Adara Holdings' involvement in the Foundation meant for the board's fiduciary position. The answer Nkechi delivered was precise and devastating. It meant the board had been operating without full disclosure of the Foundation's investment management structure for 4 years, and that correcting this would require a formal review of all governance documentation. Jeffrey Crane left that lunch visibly diminished. The Foundation's operational accounts, the ones Adiz had been quietly directing toward maximum return, were now subject to a formal transition. Adara Holdings stepped back entirely within 30 days. As Adiz had instructed, the Foundation's investment returns in the following quarter were, predictably, significantly lower. Raymond hired 2 new financial advisors to compensate. They cost considerably more than nothing, which was what Adiz had cost him. The Chicago property deal that put Raymond in such good spirits the evening of the dinner hit an unexpected regulatory complication the following week. It was not connected to Adiz. It was simply the ordinary turbulence of business. But the timing gave a quality, in the minds of those watching, of the universe maintaining its ledger. Raymond called her, twice, 3 times. She answered each call. She was not cold with him. She did not refuse him the conversation, or the grief of it. She listened to him the way she had always listened, with full attention and without interruption. And she said the things that were true, because she was a woman who had always preferred truth to convenience, that she had loved him genuinely, and that the love had coexisted for years with his failure to see her, and that the failure had not been dramatic or violent, but had been consistent enough to become its own kind of damage. She told him that her decision was not made in anger. She told him it was made in clarity. Raymond cried once during one of those calls. She let him. She did not. His sister Victoria, who had never once used a D's full name in 5 years, was observed at lunch 3 weeks later telling a companion that her sister-in-law was a remarkable woman, actually, extraordinary background, completely self-made. The companion, who had heard the story from other sources, responded with a silence that communicated everything that needed to be communicated. Pamela Crane called a D's directly, 6 days after the dinner. She called, ostensibly, to apologize. A D's listened to the apology. It was carefully worded, slightly performative in places, and underscored by the same impulse that had always driven Pamela's social calculations, the understanding that she was now on the wrong side of a power dynamic she had fundamentally misread. "I want you to know," Pamela said, "that I always thought you were extraordinary." A D's was quiet for a moment. "Thank you, Pamela," she said. She did not add anything. There was nothing to add. The record of what Pamela had thought, expressed by word and action, and telling silence across 5 years of dinner parties and galas, had already been written. A D's was simply not interested in revising it for Pamela's comfort. She moved from the townhouse on Upper East Side without ceremony, and Ketchy had arranged for her personal belongings, which were fewer and more essential than anyone might have predicted, to be transferred to the apartment in Tribeca that she had owned outright for 9 years. The apartment had been purchased through Adara Holdings' residential portfolio and had been rented to a tenant for most of the marriage. A D's had given the tenant proper notice. She moved in with her books, her mother's necklace, her work files, and a small kitchen garden she transplanted from the townhouse's window boxes. The day she moved, she called her sister Chisholm in Enugu. "It's done," she said. Chisholm was quiet for a moment. Then, "How do you feel?" A D's thought about this with genuine attention. She looked out the window of the Tribeca apartment at the city below, the Hudson catching the morning light in flat, silver sheets, the buildings standing in their rows, the ordinary motion of the world continuing without any awareness of what had shifted inside one woman's life. "Clean," she said. "I feel clean." There's a particular quality to November in New York City. The way the light comes in low and honey-colored in the late afternoons, slant across the tops of buildings and catching the edges of things. Fire escapes, water towers, the corners of windows and old brownstones. It is a light that does not flatter or soften. It illuminates. A D's thought about this one evening, 3 weeks after the dinner. Sitting at the window of the Tribeca apartment with a cup of tea, going cold in her hand, and the last of the day's light falling across the surface of the river, she thought about what her mother had understood in the way of women who have been underestimated so long that they have developed a kind of vision that those who do the underestimating never acquire, that the world constructs fictions about people, and that those fictions serve the comfort of the ones doing constructing, and that the subject of the fiction has a choice, to perform within it, to resist it loudly, or to exist so completely outside of it that the fiction eventually collapses under its own inadequacy. Her mother had built a business with a scale, a notebook, and absolute clarity about what things were worth. A D's had built $33 billion with the same instruments, translated into the language of a different century. She had also built something else, something that didn't appear in any financial filing or legal document. The knowledge that her value had never, for a single day, depended on whether Raymond Hargrove or Jeffrey Crane or Pamela Crane or Douglas Fitch or any of the people in any of those ballrooms had chosen to see it. The value had existed completely independent of their perception. She had known this, intellectually, for most of her adult life. What the years of marriage had done, slowly, painfully, usefully, was press her to know it in the deeper register, in the body, in the marrow. You cannot be diminished by someone who lacks a capacity to measure what you are. It is not their generosity that makes you significant. It is not their recognition that grants you worth. The tragedy of Raymond was not that it failed to see her. The tragedy was that he had stood next to something extraordinary for 5 years and mistaken it for furniture. That was not a wound she carried. It was, she had decided, simply a fact about him. She did not think of that evening's revelation as revenge. She had not planned it as revenge. She had planned it as correction, the removal of false narrative from public space, in the same public space where it had been most recently and most clearly performed. Nothing more. She was not angry. She was not triumphant. She was as she had told Chisholm, simply clean. The Obi Meridian Hall had been formally dedicated 2 weeks after the dinner, with a small private ceremony attended by Sophia Bertrand, Nkechi Abra, and a D's full investment team. There had been no press coverage, no announcement on social media. The name was on the wall of the building, carved in stone, the way that all things which are built to last are placed into the world, quietly, permanently, without requiring an audience. Her mother's necklace sat at her collarbone, cool and present. She thought of Grace Obi, who had traded in a market, who had calculated worth without calculators, who had looked at her younger daughter at 17 and said, "You will go further than I can see. Don't let them tell you where to stop." Her mother was 71 now and lived in a house in Enugu that Adiz had built for her 12 years ago, with a garden and a terrace and enough room for grandchildren who visited in the summers. Grace still kept a notebook, still wrote down numbers every morning, not because she needed to, but because the habit was a prayer. Adiz thought about the serving tray. She thought about the way she had held it, calmly, without resentment, as a tool of patience rather than a symbol of shame. She thought about the $20 bill, still folded in the drawer. She thought about all the evenings she had sat at tables where her name was mispronounced and her presence was misread and her work was absorbed into the background like oxygen, taken in without acknowledgement, essential and invisible. She thought about what it had cost her to hold that stillness. And she knew, in a way that only people who have paid a real price can know, that the stillness had been worth it, not because it had led to the dinner, or the display, or the envelope, or the dismantling of the fiction in that chandelier-lit room, but because in holding herself together through all of it, she had learned the exact dimensions of her own architecture. She knew, now, precisely what she was made of and precisely what she could bear, and precisely where she would choose, from this point forward, never to stand again. She would not make that choice out of bitterness. She would make it out of knowledge. There is a kind of power that announces itself with noise, that requires a room's attention, that feeds on witness and applause, that must be continuously performed to remain real. Raymond Hargrove had that kind of power. Most of the men in those ballrooms did. It was not nothing. It was real, but it was also fragile in the way of things that depend entirely on the agreement of others. And then there was the other kind, the kind that does not require announcement, that predates the room and will outlast it, that continues to compound in the quiet, in the sealed vault, in the private office with the door closed at 7 in the morning, in the voice that speaks numbers into a telephone in a language that rearranges economies, the kind that a woman can carry for years without anyone seeing it, and then, when the time finally comes, set down on a table in a white envelope and walk away from serenely, because she does not need it to prove anything to herself, that it had always been hers. It would always be hers. Outside the window, the November light finished its long fall across the river and disappeared below the horizon. The city drew its evening around itself, the lights coming on in the buildings, the noise of the streets rising into something that felt, from this height, almost like music. Adiz set her cold cup of tea on the windowsill. She picked up her notebook, the one with the soft leather cover that was worn smooth at the spine from years of use. She opened it to a new page. She began to write. Some women are underestimated their entire lives, not because they're small, but because the people around them have never developed eyes wide enough to hold what they are. The quiet ones, the patient ones, the ones who stand at the edge of a room with an empty tray and say nothing, not because they have nothing to say, but because they're listening to something more important than the conversation in front of them. They are listening to the sound of their own worth, steady and enormous, flowing beneath the surface of everything, waiting for the right moment to rise.